Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with a lecture for A&P2 students at Madison Area Technical College. This lecture is on urine volume and composition, so it's part of the urinary system. We're going to start by analyzing urine a little bit, and this is done routinely in a medical or clinical setting to assess kidney function and detect disease, a variety of diseases, including some kidney diseases. So analyzing urine is described by the term urinalysis. And I want to stress that urinalysis alone doesn't always diagnose a specific disease. Usually it's important to analyze the components of blood as well, and that more thoroughly assesses how well the kidney and its glomerulus is performing filtration, and it could help detect glomerular damage. But urinalysis will also help with this, so we're going to just talk about urine today instead of blood. We're going to start with physical properties of urine, the physical appearance, and the odor of urine. Lovely, right? So physically, urine looks pale to deep yellow. That's its color, and this yellow color is due to the presence of urochrome, a breakdown product of hemoglobin. When urine is pale, that means it's more dilute. There's more water being excreted. And when urine is dark, then it's more concentrated. There's less water, more solutes. Now, a pink or brown color to the urine might indicate the presence of blood or bile in the urine. Now, sometimes this is abnormal. As you can imagine, if there's a kidney disease or there's a problem with the glomerular capillaries, you can expect to excrete some blood, breakdown of blood cells in particular, and that would show up in the urine. But sometimes there's an abnormal color to urine due to something we've eaten or vitamin supplements we've taken. For example, beets can turn the color of urine, and vitamin B complex, and maybe some of you have noticed asparagus, for example. Your urine will look slightly different than yellow, either a little green or maybe a little pink. It's usually transparent, and if you do have cloudy urine, it could be an indication of infection. And if there is an infection, you often have pus in the urine. And the term that describes having pus in the urine is pyuria. But there can also be another cause to cloudy urine, and that is contaminating the specimen when you're collecting the urine sample. The odor or the normal smell of urine is due to the presence of urea, and I have the chemical formula or molecular formula over here on the right. It's two amine groups bound to a carbon dioxide. If the odor is stronger than normal, it will smell more like ammonia, and that's due to bacteria breaking down urea and forming ammonia, NH3. If the odor is sweet, it's usually due to glucose in the urea. The term for glucose in the urine. The term for glucose in the urine is glycosuria, and it usually gets broken down into acetone. But both of these, glucose in the urine and acetone, occur with the disease diabetes mellitus. Okay, let's move on to the chemical composition of urine. In terms of its concentration or osmolarity, urine can vary a lot. It can either be very hypotonic, meaning less concentrated to our body fluids, or hypertonic, more concentrated than our body fluids. So there's this very large range of 50 milliosmoles per liter to 1200 milliosmoles per liter. Compare that to the standard osmolarity of blood, which is 300. So there can be a range, and this is how the urinary system helps with the composition of body fluids and making sure that we're hydrated by being able to create urine that's either hypotonic or hypertonic. The pH of urine is usually 6, slightly acidic, but it ranges from 4.5, a pH of 4.5, more acidic, to a pH of 8, slightly basic. Most of urine is water, 95%. That's in a normal condition, not a diseased condition. And 5% of it is composed of solutes. Urea, as I've mentioned before, is present in the urine, and it's produced in a normal metabolism from breaking down proteins and amino acids that we routinely do, not just as part of digestion, but also in making new proteins. Sometimes the cell will break down one protein and make a different one. But there's other nitrogenous wastes as well. There's uric acid, which comes from breaking down nucleic acids. And there's creatinine. This creatinine is derived from creatine phosphate, which is present in skeletal muscle. It's one way that the skeletal muscle can store phosphate to make ATP locally. And when the phosphate's taken off, the creatine turns into creatinine. So urea, uric acid, and creatinine are all present, and they're all nitrogenous wastes, meaning they contain nitrogen. Urine will also have a variety of ions like sodium ions, potassium ions, phosphate, sulfate, calcium, magnesium, and bicarbonate. But by far it would be phosphate, sulfate, and bicarbonate. Most of the sodium actually is going to get reabsorbed. Some potassium gets secreted. Most of the calcium gets reabsorbed. Some of the magnesium gets secreted with the urine. But nonetheless, there's some concentrations of all of these ions. Not that you have to memorize them. So the amount of urine that we produce each day has a really wide normal range. Again, depending on your hydration status and the presence or absence of disease. So the normal range is 800 milliliters per day to 2,000 milliliters per day. More urine would be produced in cases of 3 different types of diseases that I'll discuss: diabetes insipidus, diabetes mellitus, and renal disease. So you could get more urine produced in those cases. You would get less urine produced in cases of dehydration, which only makes sense because your body wants to retain water. The urine would be more concentrated in that case and just have less volume. And you could also have less urine due to excessive ADH secretion. And we'll talk about that a little bit, but ADH means anti-diuretic hormone, and diuresis means to urinate. So this is a hormone that prevents urination, basically prevents water from being lost. So urine volume varies between 800 and 2,000 milliliters per day. So let's talk about those disorders just a little bit anyway, particularly the 2 diabetes disorders, diabetes mellitus and diabetes insipidus. Diabetes, that word, is defined as any metabolic disorder that results in polyuria, meaning high urine volume, and it has to be chronic, meaning it has to last for quite a while. In Greek, the word diabetes means a siphon, and that's because people with diabetes passed water like a siphon. In some cases, like Latin, diabetes is a variant of a word that means to pass through, so water's passing through, or an overflow. In all cases, we're talking about producing a lot of urine. But these two disorders vary as to their causes. So you'll have polyuria in both types of diabetes, but for very different reasons. So I'm going to start with the one that we're most familiar with, diabetes mellitus. The cause would be low insulin production, so inability to produce insulin adequately, or cells have abnormal insulin receptors. Now, we talked about insulin a little bit in A&P1 and again in A&P2, but remember, insulin is required for most body cells to take up glucose. And I apologize, but I had to pause there because I had a mistake, but insulin is required for most body cells to take up glucose and use it as an energy source. So if insulin is produced in a low amount, or the receptors aren't working for insulin, the cells won't be able to take up glucose. Therefore, glucose remains in the extracellular fluid and will go into the blood, so you'll have high blood glucose. Now, why do we have polyuria? It's because the glucose that's high in the blood will be filtered into the nephron, and normally you would think our nephron would reabsorb the glucose because our body wants to keep it as an energy source, and it does try to, but it has certain transporters in the proximal convoluted tubule that become saturated, so not all the glucose can be reabsorbed. Therefore, glucose is eliminated with the urine, and the term for that is glycosuria. Now, the polyuria happens because the water, by osmosis, follows the glucose. So the glucose in the tubular fluid causes that tubular fluid to be more concentrated, have a higher osmolarity. And therefore water stays in the nephron. It's not reabsorbed. It follows the glucose within the nephron tubule. So if water's in the nephron tubule, eventually we will urinate it. For this reason, glucose in diabetes mellitus is considered an osmotic diuretic. And just to refresh your memory about transport out of the nephron, there's transport maximums. So depending on what substance you're talking about, there is a certain quantity of glucose, we'll say in this example, that can be reabsorbed over a certain period of time, per minute usually. And so transport maximum we usually symbolize with a capital T, the subscript M. And only a certain amount can be reabsorbed due to saturation of these transporters. And for glucose, that's 320 milligrams per minute. If there's more than 320 milligrams per minute filtered into the nephron, then the excess won't be reabsorbed and it will appear in the urine. And that's what causes glycosuria. And because water follows the glucose, that's what causes polyuria. And we also looked at this picture last week having to do with transport. So normal blood glucose level, you would see all the glucose reabsorbed and water would follow. But if you have hyperglycemia, extra glucose in the blood, symbolized by more of these dots, then the transporters would be working hard, but they wouldn't be able to reabsorb all of the glucose, and water would stay within the tubule, and you would get polyuria as well as a sweet-smelling urine. Diabetes insipidus, in contrast, is not sweet-smelling. In fact, the word insipidus means tasteless, and you would think it would be odorless, but tasteless, because I don't know if I want to say ancient, a long time ago, physicians could taste the urine of patients and tell which kind of diabetes they had. And in one case, they would taste glucose, and in one example, they wouldn't. So diabetes, you still have polyuria, but you do not have glucose in the urine. And it happens because antidiuretic hormone is produced in a less of an amount. And it comes from the posterior pituitary. You might remember that the hypothalamus signals the posterior pituitary to release antidiuretic hormone. And so if there's damage to the hypothalamus in the brain or damage to the posterior pituitary, either from a blow to the head or a congenital defect or maybe a tumor, then you'll produce less antidiuretic hormone and more urine will be lost, or more water will be lost with the urine. Another cause of diabetes insipidus would be that enough ADH is produced, but the receptors for ADH either aren't working or are not present. And where these receptors are is in the collecting duct of the nephron. And ADH causes the collecting duct to make more aquaporins so that more water can be reabsorbed. But if the cells don't have receptors for ADH, they're not going to respond to it. They won't make more aquaporins, and water won't be reabsorbed from the collecting duct, at least not as well. So that brings us to the concept of diuretics in general, because a lack of ADH or hyperglycemia both act as diuretics. So a diuretic is any chemical that increases urine volume, and you might have experienced a couple of common examples like alcohol and caffeine. So when you drink alcohol, you notice you have to go to the bathroom more often. When you drink a lot of coffee, the same thing. And what happens is caffeine dilates the afferent arteriole in the renal corpuscle, so that increases glomerular filtration, the rate at which it happens. And so you just filter blood more quickly, and so you'll eventually produce more urine. Alcohol, in contrast, inhibits ADH secretion, so that's like having low ADH, like we talked about before. And so the collecting duct of all the nephrons won't reabsorb as much water. Now there are some examples of pharmaceuticals that are purposefully given to patients to cause diuresis. So these are pharmaceutical diuretics. And they're typically used to treat hypertension or some kind of heart disease. The whole purpose is to reduce blood volume and blood pressure by increasing the amount of urine that's produced. If you rid the body of more water, you're reducing your blood volume. You're actually reducing all of your body fluids, but blood included. So an example would be loop diuretics that act on the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. One example, trademark name is Lasix that you might have heard of. And what these loop diuretics do is inhibit the sodium, potassium, and chloride symporter that reabsorbs these ions. And those are the ions that are responsible for making the medulla of the nephron hyperosmotic. So without that gradient, less water will be reabsorbed in the descending limb or the collecting duct. Either one. You won't get as much water reabsorption if these ions are not reabsorbed. So that's the end of our lecture for urine volume and composition. Thank you very much for listening.